Hi, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Bruce Malone, and I worked for 30 years as a research leader for the Dow Chemical Company, developing new products as a research scientist. Now, over those years, 17 new products were patented, resulting in new innovations which made millions of dollars for the company. Now, I'll share a secret with you. I didn't get any of that money. So you're not talking to a millionaire, but I love science and I understand very, very well what it can achieve, but also what it can't achieve. Now, what we're going to discuss is where did everything come from? Where did the universe, all the matter and energy come from? Where did life come from? The DNA code, more specifically, has a bacteria slowly transformed itself over hundreds of millions of years into human beings. Now, there are two possibilities for that. One you hear as the Big Bang, cosmic evolution, chemical evolution as chemicals came alive, different places all over the universe. And you see this in movies.
They just evolve very rapidly.
Survival of the fittest.
Evolution, Morpheus. Evolution.
But evolution always wins.
All of it implying life is forming all over the universe all by itself, and have bacteria slowly transformed into people, biological evolution. The textbooks are full of this, but seldom is the alternative ever mentioned, and that is creation science. Now, you seldom hear those two words together, creation put with science. Science is typically considered reality and facts and absolute certainty. Creation is considered religion and philosophy. But we're here to show that isn't necessarily so. There is enormous scientific evidence that we do have a creator. Now, I'd like to start with one verse from what is the most printed, most read book in the history of mankind, and that's the Bible. And I'm going to just read the very first verse. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." Now, many people just think of that as a statement of religion, but in reality, that's a statement of scientific fact. You see, science is the study of time, matter, space, force, and energy. Those are the 5 things which scientists have to study to see how does the universe around us operate. And that verse addresses all 5. In the beginning is time. God is the ultimate force. If He made everything, there is no greater force. Created requires energy. The heaven is space, and the earth is mass or matter. Time, space, energy, force, and matter. All of them mentioned in the very first verse of the Bible. It's a statement of science, not religion. But how do we know if it's true? That's exactly what we're going to talk about as we proceed through this session. You know, if you take the whole evolution, creation controversy, where people are trying to figure out where did we come from, it really boils down to only 2 possibilities. You see, if you look at the entire universe like it's a box, as if this box had to have come from somewhere, either the box made itself or the box has a box maker. Now, this turns out to be a jewelry box. If you look inside of it, it's got all these finely crafted bracelets and necklaces and beaded jewels and so on. Either the jewels made themselves and just somehow appeared inside the box, or the jewels have a jewel maker. Now, the jewels might represent the finely crafted, beautiful giraffes and whales and rainforests and ants and enormous oak trees and so on. Either they made themselves, something turned into something else that turned into them, or they have a creator. Now, those are the only 2 possibilities to explain the box and what's in the box, the universe and the creation and what's in the universe. Now, it's really obvious to even a small child which one's true, but somehow it's not obvious to university biology, physics, astronomy professors. They are always looking to try to understand how did it make itself. And it's called evolution in various ways, shapes, and forms. Now, how does science work to figure out which one is true? I mean, science has created electronics and computers and put man on the moon and huge medical advances. You'd think it'd be able to figure this out too. Well, it actually does. But this is how science works. There was a man named Dr. Karl Popper. He was a science theorist, and he developed a idea that he called the white swan test to determine is something science or not. And it's like this. All science starts with an idea. I believe the box made itself. That would be like saying, I believe all swans are white. A hypothesis, a theory, it's just an idea that you go and you collect information to see if your idea is right in the simplest terms. So if my theory, my hypothesis is all swans are white, how do I use science to find out if that's correct or not? Well, you got to get data. You have to collect information to see if it fits. So suppose I went out and I went all over my state on my summer break, and I collected thousands of bits of information in my scientific notebook, and I saw that every swan that I found on every lake and every river was always white. Have I now used scientific observation to prove every swan on Earth is white? I think if you think about it, you'd realize, well, no, I haven't been everywhere. But we live in the age of information. Suppose I Facebook my friends, who email their friends, who Twitter their friends, and they know people in Australia and Germany and the Polynesian Islands and Africa and South America, and I literally get millions of people writing back with hundreds of millions of observations. Every country on the earth is represented, and all of them have only seen white swans. Have I now scientifically proven every swan on the planet is white? Well, it turns out, no, I haven't. Everybody'd have to be a perfect observer. Nobody could have blinked at the wrong time. Nobody could be a liar. Nobody could have forgotten to go somewhere. Nobody could know if there's a recessive gene inside of a swan that would eventually turn out to be a black swan and just hadn't developed yet. And on and on and on. But there is a way I could use science to absolutely 100% for sure know the truth. And that's if I found a black swan. Then I would know the truth. You see what's going on in our entire education system? There's two possibilities for our existence. Either the box made itself, or the box has a box maker. But students are only shown evidence which seems to imply the box made itself. It's called evolution, cosmic evolution, chemical evolution, biological evolution. It's just the idea, the story, that the box made itself. And yet the very laws of science have been designed to tell us this could not possibly be true. It's exactly like wanting to believe all swans are white, only showing students the white swans, and not even allowing them to see the black swans. Now, science is presented as reality, as the ultimate proof. Someone says, well, science proves this, or science says that, then people immediately believe it. But you have to understand that science is simply a tool. It's no different than any other tool. It's really, really good at some things, and it is totally useless at other things. Now, for instance, a fishing pole. A fishing pole is used for fishing. That's what it's used for, to catch fish. Now, in this case, before I go fishing, it turns out the screw is loose on my reel. So I need to tighten the screw before I can go fishing. And, you gotta get it in here so I can get the screw tightened. You don't use a hammer to tighten a screw. You've got to have a screwdriver so the right tool fits exactly into the part, and then you can tighten the screw, and then you could go fishing. Well, even after I get the screw tightened, then you've got to put bait onto the fishing pole if you're going to catch a fish. So in this case, I've got my bait. When that fish grabs onto the lure, he's gonna be caught, and I can bring him back. Okay, he'll have a staple in his mouth. So now I can cast my bait out there and catch me a fish, right? Well, you realize it is absolutely ridiculous because I'm using the wrong tool. I don't have something that is actually going to work in the application I desire. Now, science is the same way. Science is really, really good at understanding the operation of the universe, the operation of biological molecules, the operation of the instincts of animals, the operation of physics and how things come together. But it does not tell us where things came from. You understand, no scientist has a time machine. No scientist has ever went back in time to see how things form. But the very laws and the very observation of science do show us whether it's possible for things to have formed themselves, whether it's possible for life to have transformed from one type of creature into another, whether it's possible for the parts to come together in their incredible complexity to have created a living creature when you examine that creature. Now, people have made this mistake throughout time. You understand that God has told us where things came from. That is the correct tool when we're trying to understand where did things come from. Consult someone who was there to see it happen. You need to understand that God wants the truth to be known. He has told us, He's made the truth obvious so that we can know it. Now let me take you to a couple verses of Scripture that lay this out so clearly. Now, this is Romans chapter 1, starting with verse 19. Now just listen to the words. That which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shown it unto them. Now, manifest means obvious, and the them in this scripture is everybody. Everybody, everywhere, throughout time, no matter where they live, any place in the world, in the past or in the present, God says, what may be known about Him is obvious. Now, let me go on to verse 20. It says, the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. You understand, every person ever created is without excuse for belief in God because of what He has made. Now, it is by understanding and observing the very laws of science that we know God exists. Let me give you an example. The very foundational first law of science, the first law of thermodynamics, says that matter and energy can never be created and never be destroyed. Now, think about the box we talked about earlier. If you envision the entire universe as a box, either the box made itself or the box has a box maker. Now, the law of science says matter can't make itself. So what is the correct answer for where the box came from? It has to have been made by somebody outside of the time, space, matter universe. Time, space, matter, everything we see, touch, feel, and hear exists because somebody made it. The very laws of science tell us this. Now, lest you think I am exaggerating when I say the whole world around us is teaching the universe just made itself, I want you to watch a little video that I found on YouTube by a professor of astrophysics by the name of Jana as she explains where did everything come from. Watch this interesting little video clip.
I'm Jana, and I'm a professor of physics and astronomy. I work on where it all started. The simplest picture of the Big Bang starts with nothing. There's really nothing. There's no space, there's no time, there's no matter, there's no energy. It's nothing, but the potential to exist. And out of that bursts the universe. Time starts, space is created, all of the matter and the energy in the universe is born at that moment.
Now, you understand what science shows us? Nothing can do nothing. Nothing can become nothing. Nothing can transform nothing. It is nothing. To believe it could become everything in the universe is fantasy, not reality. Another law of science that points to the reality that everything around us has to have a creator is the second law of thermodynamics. Now, this law of science says everything is moving from a state of order to a state of disorder. It never goes in reverse if just left to itself. Heat always flows from hot to cold and everything becomes lukewarm eventually. You understand what this law of science is telling us? We see the entire universe winding down. Stars are exploding in supernovas. Genetic mistakes are building up. Things are not getting more and more improved with time. Animals are going extinct. If you don't maintain your bodies, if you don't maintain your car and your home, eventually it will just wear out, deteriorate, and fall apart. That is a law of science to which there aren't exceptions. Now, folks who believe in evolution, they would say, well, you know, if something is an open system, if energy is allowed into a given container, then things can improve. If you look at an acorn, which is a fairly simple structure, given time it could turn into an enormous oak tree, which is a far more complex structure. But when you hear these kind of things, what's being ignored is that the programming to produce the oak tree was already in the acorn. It already existed. Where did that programming come from? Energy coming into a set of materials does not by itself randomly improve those materials. You couldn't put a stick of dynamite in a bunch of building materials and set off the dynamite, kaboom, and have it turn into a building. We know this. It would never happen. But that doesn't even touch on the idea of where does all the time, space, matter, energy, stars, galaxies in the universe come from. They couldn't have made themselves. The entire universe has been wound up and it is winding down. A third example of a law of science, which is there so we can know what the truth is the law of biogenesis. Now, that law of science basically says life only comes from previously existing life. Now, this is pointed out in textbooks. In the 1700s, scientists would see life coming out of piles of garbage and dung, beetles and worms, and yet there didn't seem to be anything there. They didn't know where they came from. They knew nothing about microscopic organisms. They didn't believe they existed at this point in human development. So they had to come up with the idea. They believed life spontaneously generated itself. And by the way, this belief was widespread all the way up into the 1800s, even at the time of Darwin, until Louis Pasteur came along and he ran a series of experiments where he totally sterilized food and then covered it. And he found out life never comes into existence unless there's already life that's been deposited there, eggs and seeds and microorganisms. Once it's sterilized, it led to the pasteurization of milk. He realized that life doesn't just appear. And every single experiment that every single scientist and every biologist and every geneticist has ever done in the history of scientific exploration has confirmed the fact that life only comes from previously existing life. You see, chemicals could never come together to just come alive. That's what observational science shows us. But then you fast forward in the biology book, you come to the area on evolution, and it will imply that somehow chemicals came together to form proteins and cell membranes and little organisms, and the DNA code wrote itself. There's not an iota of evidence supporting this as reality. Every experiment done shows it doesn't happen, and yet it's presented as if it's a fact. Now, is that science or is that speculative religion using little bits and pieces of science to make it sound credible? See, that's the difference. You must train yourselves to separate the difference between the laws of science, which are testable and observable, and religious speculation, which is trying to explain everything without God. Because without God, we think we escape accountability. If there's no God, we can do what we want. We can behave the way we want. We can have the morality we want. And that's exactly what we see happening in the world all around us. A speculative religion masquerading itself as if it's science versus hard, true, observational science, which is what the laws of science show us. The box has to have a box maker.
So how did life develop when the laws of science say it can only come from life that already exists? Well, in the textbooks, whenever you study biology,
It refers to an experiment done 70 years ago called the Urey-Miller experiment, where a scientist took methane, ammonia, water, he added an explosive spark, boom, of energy, and he created what were called the amino acids. Now, these are referred to as the building blocks of life because it's assumed because these chemicals could form explosively, they could link up to form proteins that would go on to form life. Now, the students aren't told certain things, such as you got right and left-hand amino acids, yet they can't be separated in any known way, and life only uses left-handed. It could never possibly form a useful protein. They never got all of the 20 amino acids needed to form life, only about 6 of them. So the experiment totally fails to explain where life could have come from. So how could life have formed? Well, let's do an experiment. Science is about experimentation and then drawing conclusions from the results. Now, our bodies are like unbelievably complex machines made with hundreds of thousands of specifically designed parts. They're designed to come together to form a living cell in the various different kinds of cells of our body. The simplest form of life, a bacteria, has at least 1,000 different parts. Well, that's way too complex to experiment with. Let's just see, can a little machine made out of lots of parts, just 7 parts, ever come together all by itself? We're going to look at what I call the magic can of evolution to see, can even 7 parts, the 7 parts of a simple pen, reassemble to form a working pen?
Now, I'd like to do experiments. I've used science all my life, so I thought, how could you figure out, has the components of life come together or not all by themselves to have formed a working, finished form of life? So I like to do an experiment which I call the magic can of evolution. So I've got a magician here, and he's pulling different forms of life out of his hat. Now, I thought, well, I don't have a form of life that I can pull out of my magic can, but I'm going to dump everything out of my can, and what's in it is actually a pen. Now, if you think about an ink pen, it is a small little machine. It's a working, functioning whole made of multiple parts. So the question is, could something even as simple as a working ink pen ever produce itself by random natural processes? Well, let's just pull it apart. We've got a pen. It has a tip. It has an ink cartridge. It has a tube which holds everything together. And inside of the tube, there's a button to help it click, a little mechanism so it goes click, 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 and then a clip to put it on your pocket. So we actually have all of the parts needed to make a working ink pen inside the can. Now, you already have a problem because none of these parts could have made themselves. They don't occur naturally. And by the way, every chemical that we find in every living organism throughout the biosphere of the Earth is made of components which do not occur naturally. See, they only occur inside of living organisms. They're made by the organisms that are already alive. They don't just float around out there, just like the parts of the pen aren't floating around. But even if you have all the parts, and even if you put those parts in an enclosed space, and even if you could add energy, like by shaking the can, or tossing the can, or spinning the can, or let's say I shook this can for about 1 billion years. This is going to be a very long class today. Time isn't the answer. Will the parts ever come together to form a working pen? And I think you inherently know the answer. Absolutely not. So I thought, well, if I'm going to you have to do science, you've got to try things. So let's add explosive energy to the magic can of evolution. And I happen to have some firecrackers here. Isn't science fun? Okay, so we'll light the firecracker. Let her drop in the can. Wait. We blow the lid off the can. Now, then, if you're going to do an experiment, you got to see what the results are. Have the parts of the pen come back. Oh man, and you hate it when this happens, but sure enough, there's the parts of the pen reassembled by an explosion. Now, I know many of you watching this, you're just laughing. You know that that's absolutely ridiculous. There is no possibility that could be true. You know, you've already guessed, there were 2 pins in the can. I just pulled out the previously assembled pin. Now, just think about this for a moment. What was so ridiculous that it's laughable that explosive energy could cause perfectly designed complex parts to come together to form a working mechanism is taught as an absolute fact throughout our education system. And yet in the case of life, you have to have hundreds of parts that don't occur naturally, all coming together to form perfectly formed amino acids, where you line up the parts in a specific sequence, which statistically could never happen in nature. It's a million times more ridiculous to believe life could form in this way than what was laughable, the idea that a firecracker could bring a pin together. You understand, we have to explain the truth to the next generation, that what they're hearing in their classrooms, in their museums, simply could not be true. And the very understanding of the design of nature shows us that this is the case.
The most basic law of science says matter and energy could never make itself. Well, then the only option left is that there has to be a creator. That's how science shows us the truth. The very next foundational law of science says everything is deteriorating and winding down and randomness is increasing. Well, then evolution can't be true because it says things have gotten more and more complex. The only way complexity can increase is if there is a program or intelligence controlling the energy input. The DNA code could never write itself. It's the most complex language or coded information in the universe, and we know these things don't write themselves. And life is so complex, it will never come alive by itself. We have done millions of experiments, spent billions of dollars trying to get chemicals to come alive, and the result of every single one of these experiments is the same. Life never forms itself, 0 times. What conclusion should we draw as intelligent people and scientists? Then something outside of life must have made life. These are the ways which God makes it absolutely obvious that He exists. But what about the rocks? What about the fossils? There are rock layers 1,000 meters deep. How did they get there? Well, just like the box that represents the universe, either the box made itself or the box has a box maker, these rock layers must have either been laid down very slowly and gradually over literally hundreds of millions of years, or there's another explanation. They were formed rapidly and recently by an enormous globe-covering flood that ripped up entire land surfaces, washed tsunami waves across entire continents, broke up the continental plates that moved into new positions rapidly, shoving up mountains at the end of this enormous flood catastrophe, and restructured the entire face of the earth. Now, those are 2 completely different concepts of where things came from. You see, as we look in these rock layers, we do tend to find sea creatures deeper down in the rock layers. We tend to find coal seams further up. We tend to find land animals further up. But when we dig these animals out of these rock layers, they have turned to solid stone. The very chemicals of their body have been replaced by minerals. Now, this is a trilobite. It's an animal, and we found hundreds of thousands of these in the rock layers, which is no longer alive today. How do we know how it got in the rock layers? You see, when you dig an animal like this up, it's called a fossil. It used to be alive. It's now a rock replica of the animal that used to be alive. It doesn't talk to you. Nobody's ever dug up a trilobite and, like putting a seashell to your ear, put it to the ear to listen and see, does it tell me anything? And they'll hear it saying, 100 million years ago, I was living at the bottom of the ocean. Really? What happened? A rock hit me in the head and I died. No, that's ridiculous. It doesn't talk, it has to be interpreted. And if you assume enormous periods of time created all these rock layers filled with dead animals, you're going to interpret them that way. But if you consider the possibility there has been this world-covering flood, and then look at all the evidence, I believe it becomes very, very clear that that is what created the rock layers and buried the animals. The lower layers would have been buried first as sediment washed off the continental surfaces and buried animals living down low in the oceans, so obviously they would be buried first. Not because they evolved first, but because they were buried first. Enormous mats of trees and vegetation, as they are packed down and buried, would have turned into coal seams further up. And finally, the most mobile animals, land animals, birds, etc., would have been buried highest up of all. See, none of this proves evolution. It's simply an interpretation. The Bible spends more time, more space talking about the worldwide flood than the creation of the entire universe and all the diversity of life. So it must be important, and it shows up in the book of Job and in Psalms and in the prophets. It shows up by Jesus referring to it in the book of Hebrews. From cover to cover, it keeps coming up, the worldwide flood. But not just the Bible, every culture in the world, in the Philippines, in Fiji, Australia with Aborigines, the Russians, the Africans, South America, Alaska, from Alaska to Australia, from the Philippines to Peru, the ancient cultures of the world across the world have historical accounts of a flood that wiped out all of humanity. Well, that's because we all came from Noah and his family, and all these cultures arose after that. This is a real event, and it has enormous implications as we study these fossils and rock layers about when and how they formed. Now let's look at some examples of how we can know this flood is the correct explanation for where everything came from. When animals die today, they don't form fossils. You know, in the late 1800s, there were enormous herds of buffalo roaming around in the Great Plains. I mean, unfathomably large numbers of enormous animals. Well, the great game hunters of the day discovered that if they can identify and shoot the lead buffalo, the rest of the buffalo wouldn't stampede. And they could just sit there and shoot buffalo after buffalo after buffalo. And over a period of 20 to 50 years, they drove the buffalo to the point of extinction, wiping out enormous herds. They basically skinned them and left the rest to rot. So there were hundreds of millions of buffalo carcasses laying all over the Great Plains in the 1800s. And yet today you can't find a single buffalo fossil. When your fish dies in a fish tank, it either bloats and floats or drops to the bottom eventually. It doesn't turn into a fossil. It is eaten by scavengers and bacteria and crabs and other critters, and it doesn't fossilize. To form a fossil, you have to bury an animal very deeply and very rapidly.
One of the other evidences that a worldwide flood is the correct explanation for the sedimentary rock layers of the earth is the existence of these packed together fossil graveyards that we literally find all over the world. They're not like rare, they're actually quite common. Now, for instance, as you look at this rock, it's a layer of basically shale or mudstone, which is in essence mud that's been compacted down and turned into rock. Now, as you look closer, you find trails or tracks of things that were crawling along, impressions of worm-like creatures, ancient extinct animals called crinoids, seashells that look identical to seashells today. As a matter of fact, about 95% of all fossils are sea creatures because the flood just wiped out trillions of animals that lived in the ocean, and they got buried into this mud that built up as fossil record. Now, if you look closer, you'll see just dozens and dozens of little animals and seashells and things that are compacted into these rock layers. You find them on both the front and the back. Now, that is not a living environment. These animals didn't live that closely together. They were literally picked up by this flood, moved in enormous waves, compacted and forced down to turn into fossils that we find today in these rock layers all over the earth. Now, the other thing we often find are sea creatures buried in these fossil graveyards along with land creatures. Dinosaurs found with seashells, possums found with fish. These things don't live together. They were destroyed by this enormous flood, washed together, compacted, and turned into layers and layers of rocks, such as this, all over the world. Strong evidence that this worldwide flood is reality. One of the strongest evidences for a world-covering flood that created all the sediment and sedimentary rock layers of the earth are what are called polystrate fossils. We'll often see trees like this laying in a forest in a horizontal position, but imagine a tree not laying horizontally but vertically, running up through multiple strata layers or many different levels of different kinds of sediment. Suppose you walk through a forest one day and you find a tree laying on the ground like this. Do you think it's still going to be here, say, 100 years from now? Or how about 1,000 years from now? You know it's not. It's going to turn back into soil. You see there are locations in Germany and Nova Scotia. There's a very classic one in Cookeville, Tennessee, where a fossilized tree going through a coal seam that's about 20 feet thick, up through a limestone layer that's another 10 to 20 feet thick, and then into a second coal seam. Now, if what we hear about the layers of the earth being millions and billions of years old is correct, in essence, what that is saying is that there was a tree standing upright while the coal formed, and then an ocean moves in, and slowly limestone starts to form around the tree as diatoms and plankton and various sea creatures die. And then the ocean recedes, another swamp forms, and another coal layer forms, all while the tree is standing upright. Now, think about that. You have a tree standing upright for hundreds of thousands or millions of years without ever toppling over, while an ocean comes and goes and swamps come and go. It makes absolutely no sense. What makes perfect sense, what is an absolutely obvious explanation, is that one layer after another were rapidly laid down, and that's why there can be polystrate fossils. So once again, here's another example of how we can know these rock layers were laid down sequentially and rapidly with no missing time in between, exactly as the Bible tells us. One last, even more profound way of absolutely knowing the truth. If dinosaurs had been in the ground for 60 million or 65 or 70 million years, then there could not scientifically in any way be any biological organic tissue left inside of those bones. See, we know how fast proteins and enzymes and cartilage and various parts of a human or animal body degrades. And at best, even at laboratory pristine conditions, things that are parts of our bones, parts of our bodies, they could last 10, 20, or 30,000 years under ideal conditions without totally degrading. About 10 years ago, a researcher named Dr. Mary Schweitzer out in Wyoming found a Tyrannosaurus rex bone on one of her summer digs. As it broke, she later recounted that she smelled something that smelled like decaying flesh or tissue. And it surprised her because she knew it couldn't be there if it was part of the original dinosaur. But her curiosity was perked, so she got permission to dissolve away the bone with very weak acids. Inside, she found soft, stretchy tissue. She found blood vessels that had not decayed, and you could clearly identify blood cells inside of these blood vessels. Now, that caused a fiery, raging storm of controversy. And for 5 years, she published her paper in a major scientific peer-reviewed magazine, but she was very tentative to claim this was true dinosaur tissue. It was explained away as some sort of a bacterial film or misinterpretation of the evidence, but she continued to study it, and over the ensuing years proved that the tissue was reptilian in nature, could not have been from bacteria, showed that there were remaining DNA fragments, not the whole DNA structure, but enough to show the DNA was still there, and started to find tissue in other dinosaurs, as has other the researchers, to the point where it is irrefutable. The only possibility, really scientifically accurate interpretation of this find, is that that tissue is still there because those bones could not possibly be millions of years old.
The scientific world is still reeling from the discovery of actual Tyrannosaurus rex cells and soft tissue unearthed last week at a Montana excavation site.
Thank you for having me.
So, is that amazing to find this kind of soft tissue in a fossil this old? And what can the soft tissue really tell us?
Well, it's very amazing. It's utterly shocking, actually, because it flies in the face of everything that we understand about how tissues and cells degrade.
It's 70 million years old. You don't expect to find soft tissue, do you?
Not at all. No. It was utterly shocking.
So you have to sort of rewrite the book as far as fossilization goes, I assume.
Well, that's the exciting part for me. I've always been very intrigued by how things change in going from a living being to part of the rock record. And like I said, a lot of our science doesn't allow for this. All of the chemistry and all of the molecular breakdown experiments that we've done.
You know,
don't allow
Mary,
for
when
this.
I was reading about this story, I was amazed that in some of the capillaries, when you went to pull them, they snapped right back. Are you amazed at the quality of these remains?
Absolutely.
70 million years old, huh?
It's just doesn't seem possible. It's just I can't explain it, to be honest.
Very cool.
Well, Professor Mary Schweitzer, congratulations and thank you very much for stopping by.
Thank you so much.
Just so that you understand the very significant implication of this tissue not being millions of years old, you understand if that tissue is not millions of years old, which the fact that it's still soft shows, then that means those rock layers can't be millions of years old. And if those rock layers aren't millions of years old, the only option left is that they were laid down rapidly and recently, literally by a worldwide flood, exactly the way it is described in the Bible. Children are systematically being trained to think in only one possible way. Millions and billions of years this, millions and billions of years that, millions of years, billions of years, hundreds of millions of years. Everywhere they go, they see it, they hear it over and over and over again. It becomes the framework of reality and truth through which they will filter everything to the point they can't even consider the possibility that anything else could be true. And it totally ignores the biblical viewpoint that there has been a worldwide flood. Those time frames are fantasy. The rock layers of the planets were laid down very, very rapidly, even when you put absolutely obvious examples right in front of them. There is a group of scientists that belong to the Creation Research Society, over 1,000 PhD scientists, who all acknowledge the data from the world around us actually fits a biblical model better than this long age evolutionary model. And I had the privilege of interviewing these folks and asking each of them a few specific questions about why they had come to the conclusion the Bible could be trusted in the area of science.
I was fascinated with the amino acids that we're made of. You probably know that your body is about 50% proteins, and proteins are made up of a chain of amino acids. And if you look at those amino acids, they're actually two different forms. And those amino acids in the protein, half are left-handed and half are right-handed. In the laboratory, you just make 50-50. But when you look at the human body, every amino acid is left-handed. There's no possible way that could have happened by accident.
Well, you can take any part on your human body, but let's take something that it's really visible to everybody, and that's your hand. And your hand shows all the elements of any good design, and that is multiple parts working together for a purpose. And clearly your hand has multiple parts working together for a purpose. Your eye has it, your heart has it. You can point to anything on your body. But when we see multiple parts working together for a purpose, and particularly a lot of parts working together for a purpose, we know from all of human history that the only source of that is an intelligent designer. An intelligent designer, every time we see it in man-made things, it always has an intelligent source. There are no exceptions to that. So when we see it in living things, I conclude the same thing.
I think the strongest irrefutable evidence is the origin of information. Information doesn't just suggest an intelligence that fashioned it, it demands it. All of information theory is built on that beginning principle, and to deny that is to simply turn your back on truth.
Generally, people assume that science has a different message than the Bible, and that you generally have to choose between the two. You know, the two certainly are not in conflict, and that true science always confirms what we see in the Bible. And again, it's about those starting points that we use. We actually reverse it. We use the Bible, proper understanding of the Bible, to properly understand science and as a framework for biology, astronomy, geology, and anthropology.
My name is John Sanford, and I've been a research scientist all my life. And the first half of my career, I was actually a hardcore evolutionist, and I was absolutely certain about human evolution and that it was a fact. But people change, and a time came when I started to critically examine the idea that man evolved from an ape. And I realized that that's really the main issue with evolution, is not where fruit flies came from or snails came from, but where did people come from? And so that's really the heart of this issue, is were we made miraculously and made in the image of God, or are we descendants of apes, and did we arise by simple natural processes like mutation and selection? The very best evidence against human evolution is genetics. So I'd like to read a quote here from Bill Gates, who knows a little bit about computers, right? And so he says this: "The understanding of life is a great subject. Biological information is the most important information we can discover because over the next several decades it will revolutionize medicine. Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created." And in other words, the information system, just the information system within the DNA, is more sophisticated than our best computer scientists can program. Way beyond what they could ever accomplish. Oftentimes when people try to teach the idea of ape to man evolution, they use like an illustration, and so you just reshape a chimp into a human. But you see, what makes a human is the information. The human who has the genetic information necessary for doing calculus and sending men to the moon and doing art. They're programmed to be humans and to have human bodies, and that information is in the DNA. And chimpanzees are programmed to be chimpanzees and to behave like chimpanzees. They're really good at climbing trees, and they're really good at peeling bananas, for example. So this programming, it requires reprogramming. Now, one thing that computer scientists really understand really clearly is that programs don't arise by themselves. And you can't just trial and error try to improve a program. Well, let's just change a bit here and a bit there and a byte there, and maybe it'll morph into a totally new functional program. That's not how computer science works, and that's not how any information system works. Information is the product of intelligence.
So we've heard from just a few highly qualified scientists who acknowledge the biblical model of creation is supported by the facts of science. But how come they're in the minority? How come your textbooks are filled with the ideas of evolution, and you see it in the movies, you see it on the internet as you go and search this subject? And the majority do fall into line believing everything made itself. Well, again, the Bible gives us the answer. There's a statement in Isaiah. It says, "We all, like sheep, have gone astray." Now, human beings tend to follow others. We tend to just assume what we're told is true. And once that becomes a framework of what we think is reality, it's difficult to even think in a different way. I'd like you to watch a short little video of how easy it is for any of us to just fall right into the pattern of behaving and believing something just because everybody around us does it.
And here she is, right on time for her 12 o'clock appointment.
Hi, how are you doing?
This woman thinks she's here for a free eye exam.
Have you been here before? No, it's my first time.
What she doesn't know is that everyone else in this room is working for us.
They'll be with you in just a couple minutes.
Today we're running an experiment on social conformity, and the test starts now. Did you hear that? These people sure did. It doesn't take long for our test subject to notice a pattern. Beep means stand up. But why? And if you were in her shoes, what would you do the next time the tone sounds? To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think right now.
Now that was pretty humorous, wasn't it? Those people have no idea why they're standing up. They're just doing it because everybody else does it. Well, it's even more prevalent in the scientific community. Once there's a scientific consensus that evolution's a fact, that everything made itself, and once we leave God out of our thinking, the only thing left is evolution, and it's just assumed to be true. But majority does not determine truth. Just because a lot of people think something's true doesn't make it true. And God warns us of this strongly. Romans 12:2 says, "Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." You understand what God is telling us? The world thinks in a way that leaves him out of their thinking, so they come to the wrong conclusion. 10 times we are told creatures reproduce after their own kind. Birds only make birds, trees only make trees, fish only make fish. Nobody has ever observed a fish-ostrich blend, a dog-cat blend. They don't exist. Very different body structures are just simply there. Now, if evolution was just used to mean there's variety with any kind of creature, it's absolutely true. And the word is used that way. There's all sorts of varieties of dogs, but they stay dogs. All sorts of varieties of whales, but they stay whales. Lots of different looks and shapes of people, but they stay people. See, that's not bacteria to human evolution. That has never been observed. It says there's been a worldwide flood. This would have created the rock layers recently and rapidly. But if you leave these things out of your thinking, the only thing left is, well, if God didn't make people, some sort of apish thing must have turned into us, and some sort of four-legged thing must have turned into that, and a sea creature must have turned into that. Never been observed. It's faith, not science, and it's assumed to be true. So do not be conformed to the thinking of this world. As a matter of fact, your school wants you to use your mind to consider all possibilities. You see, you have the opportunity to think outside of the box. The world around us assumes the box made itself, assumes life made itself, assumes the DNA code wrote itself. None of this has ever been observed. It's just assumed to have happened because they're leaving God out of their thinking. God is not part of the universe He made. He's outside of it. So I would encourage you to think about everything you've learned. Take the book that you're receiving that has lots more information and come to your own conclusion. What is the truth? And don't just assume everything you're told is true. And thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this session today.